God's free gift. When presenting the gospel message, we must make sure we clearly explain that salvation is God's free gift. Here's Gene to explain.
That principle permeates the whole of Galatians. But we see this immediately right at the very beginning of the letter. Let's jump right into Paul's introduction. Paul, an apostle, and then he says, not from men. And that's key. Ordinarily, he wouldn't begin the letter that way. But again, there is a defense of his apostleship, and we'll see why. Not from men. I'm not an apostle from men or by man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brothers who are with me to the churches of Galatia. Let's look at verses 6 of chapter 1. And as you read this passage, you're going to discover that Paul is angry. He is really upset. And he says, I am amazed that you are so quickly turning away from him who called you by the grace of Christ. I can't believe this is happening. And are turning to a different gospel. Sounds like what he said to the Corinthians in the second letter. Not that there is another gospel. There isn't. But there are some who are troubling you and want to change the gospel of Christ. They're really preaching another Jesus. But here's where Paul really nails these guys. And he's upset with the Corinthians, or with the Galatians as well. Even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel other than what we have preached to you, a curse be on him. Now, basically, what he's talking about here, and to whom he's talking, are these false apostles, these deceivers. And we have said before, I now say it again, if anyone preaches to you a gospel contrary to what you received, a curse be on him. This is horrible in Paul's way of thinking. Now, it's possible, see, that Paul even knew, he doesn't name them, but he knew who these people were. It would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it? He was in these cities. The trip took about 3 years. So it was about a year and a half as he was moving from city to city, about a year and a half as he returned to these cities. And he got to know some of these individuals probably quite well, and especially those who tried to have him stoned. And so he's mad, and he's upset because he sees these false teachers coming in behind all of that effort. And he actually almost lost his life, Paul did. He was stoned, left for dead. And it's not so much he was concerned about himself, he was concerned about what was happening to those believers. And again, referring to his letter to Titus, this again gives us some understanding of why Paul was so upset. Again, repeating this from what we looked at in 2 Corinthians, there are also many rebellious people, idle talkers, deceivers, especially those from what? Judaism. These were false Judaizers that came in after Paul left and was destroying those churches, dismantling these churches. And he said, it's necessary to silence them. They overthrow whole households by teaching for dishonest gain what they should not. And when you read the introduction to Galatians, you can just hear that word. We've got to silence them. Why? Because they are distorting the gospel of God's grace, which Paul so clearly explained in Titus or in Ephesians. So Ephesians 2:8 and 9 says, for by grace you're saved through faith. They came in and said, no, you've got to keep the law. Particularly, you got to be circumcised. You got to keep the dietary laws. Otherwise, you cannot be saved. That's what they were teaching them. And of course, Paul in Ephesians says, no, you're saved by grace through faith. That's really the message that runs through the whole of Galatians. And this is not from yourselves. It's not keeping the law. It is God's gift, not from works, so that no one can boast. And so Paul is addressing these issues very, very directly in this Galatian letter. That gives you the background. That gives you the setting. And I believe it refers to those churches there in Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, and Derbe. These were the Galatian churches. The question is, why do so many religious leaders confuse faith and works when it comes to explaining the message of salvation? That is a critical issue because it's the means of eternal life. We're not saved by works. We're saved by grace through faith. And that's why Paul was so intense. This is distortion. It's false theology. It's satanic. Now, it's part of human nature as well, and Satan takes advantage of that because we feel like it's too simple to just receive it as a gift. We got to do something. And so consequently, Satan takes advantage of that and distorts it. And, by the way, to teach that you're saved by works plus grace, or just by works, is one of the most significant ways to manipulate people as a religious leader. If you want to manipulate people, you want to control people, you control them with fear. If they don't do certain things that is demanded, they will lose their salvation or they will never ever have it. And if you want to manipulate people, that's the way to go. And that's why in every false cult you have that system. And once you get people to believe that, you've got them in the palm of your hand. You brainwash them, you control them, you control their pocketbook, you control their effort, you control everything about them. Because they believe that if they don't follow what you're teaching, they won't have eternal life. And if you look at every ism, every cult, that's the basis of their theology. Whether it's Mormonism, whether it's Christian Science, whatever it is in terms of a false cult, isms and so forth, they always control their people by saying they have to do certain works. And that's why Paul was so upset about this, because these Judaizers were controlling these people, and he was very upset about that. Thank God for Martin Luther, because up until the time of Luther and some of the other reformers, they were under the domination of a Christian system that says you're saved by works. And that exists still today. And Martin Luther, who was a priest, said no. He was under that domination, under that control, under that burden. And once he understood salvation by grace through faith, through reading Galatians and Romans, he was set free. He was born again. And that gave birth, of course, to the whole Protestant Reformation. And the essence of the Protestant Reformation is faith only. Only faith brings salvation. And that, of course, is the message that Paul is teaching here. And that's why so many religious leaders confuse faith and works when it comes to explaining the message of salvation. Well, they're deluded themselves, or they know what is the truth and they're going to delude people and control them with a very false system. And that indeed is a tragedy.